The silence in the Braxton house. There are families that survive by protecting each other. And then there are families that survive by protecting secrets. The Braxton family has always sold the image of unity: 5 sisters bonded by blood, gospel roots, fame, and shared struggle. On television, they argued loudly, cried openly, and forgave publicly. But what happens when the loudest thing in a family is what no one will say? That is where this story begins. Not with a scandal headline, not with a viral clip, but with fear. I'm afraid of the reality. Those words weren't screamed, they weren't weaponized, they were whispered, fragile, trembling, and loaded with years of pain. And when someone says they are afraid of reality itself, that tells you something unspeakable is buried beneath the surface. This wasn't gossip at first. This was avoidance. Please, I don't have time for gossip right now. That line alone tells you everything, because when someone refuses to call something gossip, it usually means it's too real to dismiss. When content creator Locatia Keisha began digging into the situation involving Ashley Braxton, she didn't expect to uncover a pattern. She expected a story. What she found instead was a thread, one that pulled straight through the heart of the Braxton family history. Ashley Braxton is not just a distant relative. She is Michael Braxton's daughter, the niece of Tamar, Tony, Trina, Tawanda, and the rest of the sisters. And Michael Braxton, notably, is the one sibling who has remained largely invisible to the public. 5 sisters, 1 brother, and somehow the brother is never around. That absence, for years, was treated as normal. But once Ashley began speaking, the silence started to feel intentional. Ashley didn't just describe tension, she described fear, control, emotional intimidation, and most disturbingly, she described being pressured not to speak about what went on inside the household. Don't talk about the household. That phrase doesn't come from nowhere. People don't issue warnings like that unless there is something to protect. And when a child is instructed to guard family secrets, it's rarely about privacy, it's about survival. As Locatia revisited Ashley's interviews, one thing became painfully clear. Ashley wasn't just talking about strict parenting or family conflict. She was describing a pattern of emotional harm, a home environment ruled by intimidation, silence, and fear of consequences. And then something else surfaced. Viewers began telling Locatia something she hadn't fully processed before. Tamar was abused too. That revelation changed everything, because once Tamar's past statements were re-examined, the similarities between her experience and Ashley's became impossible to ignore. Tamar Braxton had publicly stated that she was sexually assaulted from the age of 6 to the age of 16. Not once, not vaguely, repeatedly, over a decade. She also stated something even more chilling, that the abuse happened inside the household and that it involved more than one person. Now, here is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable and why so many people would rather look away. Tamar is the youngest sibling. Michael Braxton is significantly older. If Tamar was 6 and her brother was roughly 9 years older at the beginning of the alleged abuse period, that doesn't automatically make him responsible, but it places him within the proximity. And proximity matters. Locatia was careful not to accuse. She didn't say Michael Braxton was the perpetrator. What she did say was this: there is one person in common. Ashley's allegations center on her father. Tamar's trauma centers on her household, and the common denominator is Michael Braxton. That doesn't equal guilt, but it does demand scrutiny, especially when you consider this. Michael Braxton's own daughter has publicly described him as abusive. That alone is not gossip. That is testimony. Ashley said she was bullied into silence, bullied into loyalty, bullied into protecting the family image. And suddenly, Tamar's bond with Ashley made sense. People wondered why Tamar seemed so protective of her niece, why she moved differently when Ashley spoke out, why she didn't dismiss her claims like others did. But survivors recognize survivors. They recognize the language, the pauses, the fear of not being believed. When Tamar spoke about her past, she didn't dramatize it, she didn't perform it. She said it with exhaustion, the kind that only comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. And yet, instead of protection, she received skepticism. Instead of compassion, she received disclaimers. Her sisters would later say, "That is her truth, not necessarily the truth." And that sentence, quiet, polished, and devastating, would fracture everything. Because when someone discloses abuse and the response is to separate their truth from reality, the implication is clear. You're saying they're lying, or at least mistaken. And that's where the betrayal truly begins. When the truth became a storyline. By the time Tamar Braxton sat across from Tamron Hall, the damage had already been done. Not to her career, not to her image, but to her trust. Because what Tamar was carrying into that interview wasn't just trauma, it was betrayal layered on top of betrayal, stacked so high that even her own voice sounded like it was fighting to be heard through the weight of it. When Tamar finally spoke publicly about being abused from the age of 6 to the age of 16, she didn't do it for sympathy. She did it because the story had already been taken from her. She said something that should have stopped the conversation cold. She said her pain had been used. According to Tamar, when the Braxton family agreed to appear on Ayanla Fix My Life, they were seeking healing, not content, not ratings, not spectacle. Help. But somewhere between the confession and the camera cuts, Tamar believed someone inside her own family told producers about her abuse without her consent. Let that sink in. If her claim is true, that means the most painful experience of her life was not revealed by her choice, but offered up to television executives as a narrative hook. And Tamar didn't mince words about how that made her feel. She said she felt exploited, used for a storyline, reduced to trauma for entertainment, turned into content. That accusation alone fractured the family in ways that never fully healed. Because when money, fame, and trauma intersect, the question becomes brutal and unavoidable. Who benefits? Tamar didn't just talk about sexual abuse. She talked about domestic sexual abuse, a term that made many viewers pause. It wasn't language people were used to hearing in celebrity interviews, and it wasn't thrown around casually. She explained that it involved coercion, violation without consent, and harm inflicted within a domestic setting, inside the very place meant to be safe. What made it worse was not just the acts themselves, but the aftermath, the silence, the disbelief, the rewriting of history. Tamar said she no longer trusted her family, not because they didn't love her, but because love without validation feels hollow. And then came the moment that would haunt the Braxton name for years, the suicide attempt. When Tamar was found unconscious after attempting to kill herself, the public learned about it almost instantly. The 911 call leaked, the audio spread, her most vulnerable moment became viral before her family even knew what had happened. That detail matters. Her sisters found out through social media. Not a phone call, not a private message, not an emergency notification. Twitter, Instagram, blogs. And the reaction from her sisters when questioned later was not sorrow first. It was shock mixed with resentment. They were upset that they weren't told. They were upset that the story got out. They were upset about how it looked. They emphasized protocol. They emphasized procedure. They emphasized what should have happened. But Tamar was lying in a hospital bed, fighting to stay alive. That contrast between logistics and survival did not go unnoticed by viewers. When asked who leaked the 911 call, the sisters were clear about one thing. It wasn't us. They distanced themselves completely. They said they didn't know how it got out. They said the network didn't do it. They said they found out the same way everyone else did. And then attention quietly shifted toward the person who was present, Tamar's then boyfriend, the man on the N11 call, the man who, according to critics, referenced the network while her girlfriend was in crisis. That detail raised eyebrows, because who mentions television contracts while someone they love is dying? The sisters implied, without outright saying it, that whoever released that tape was the one responsible for violating Tamar's privacy. They insisted her family did not betray her. But Tamar didn't see it that way. When Braxton Family Values Season 7 aired, Tamar went to social media with fury that felt raw and unresolved. She said she was no longer employed by the network, yet her pain was still being used to make a coin. That phrase echoed, "Make a coin." To Tamar, the show wasn't documenting reality, it was profiting from her collapse. Her sisters pushed back. They said they didn't discuss Tamar's mental health. They said they only discussed how they felt. They said they were asked questions and they answered honestly. And here is where the line blurred beyond repair. Because when Tamar accused the show of staging reactions, her sister said nothing was staged, only reenacted. That word, reenacted, did not land well with the audience. To Tamar, reliving the moment her family found out felt like performance. To her sisters, it was simply television mechanics. Two perspectives, two realities, one family. But then came the sentence that changed how many people heard everything that followed. Tamar spoke her truth. That doesn't mean it's the truth. That was said calmly, respectfully, almost gently, but it landed like a slap. Because when someone discloses abuse and the response is to separate their truth from the truth, the message underneath is unmistakable. You're questioning credibility. You're casting doubt. You're protecting something or someone. For Tamar, that moment confirmed her worst fear, that even now, even after everything, her family still did not fully believe her. And when that doubt sits next to Ashley Braxton's allegations, claims of abuse, control, and enforced silence inside the same bloodline, the picture becomes far more disturbing. Two generations, similar language, overlapping proximity, and a family that insists on moving forward without fully looking back. Tamar unfollowed her sisters. She unfollowed her mother. And while they brushed it off as something she's done before, the timing said otherwise. This wasn't social media drama. This was withdrawal, distance, self-preservation. Because sometimes the only way to survive a family is to step away from it.
Because sometimes the only way to survive a family is to step away from it. The niece who broke the pattern. Every family's secret survives the same way. Silence. Not loud silence. Not dramatic silence. But the kind that settles in so deep it starts to feel normal. The kind that gets passed down quietly, disguised as loyalty, respect, or keeping family business in the family. For years, that silence protected the Braxton name. Until Ashley Braxton spoke. Ashley didn't storm the internet. She didn't chase interviews. She didn't weaponize hashtags. When she began telling her story, it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded hesitant, cautious, like someone who had spent most of her life measuring every word. Because she had. Ashley is Michael Braxton's daughter, Tamar's niece, blood of the same bloodline that built an empire on harmony, sisterhood, and survival. But Ashley's experience, according to her own words, didn't reflect any of that. She described a household ruled not by love, but by fear. She said she was emotionally abused, controlled, and pressured into silence. She spoke about being told, explicitly, not to discuss what happened behind closed doors. Don't talk about the household. That instruction didn't come once. It came repeatedly, and the repetition matters. Because no one repeatedly warns a child to stay silent unless there is something dangerous about the truth. Ashley said she was bullied into compliance, that her voice was treated as a threat, that speaking up was framed as betrayal, not survival. And what made her claims impossible to ignore was not just what she said, but how closely her language mirrored Tamar's, years apart. Both spoke about betrayal. Both spoke about being blamed. Both spoke about being isolated within the family structure. Different generations. Same emotional aftermath. When Ashley finally went public, the response was mixed. Some praised her bravery. Others questioned her motives. Some dismissed her entirely. But very few asked the most uncomfortable question of all. Why does this keep happening in the same family? Ashley's allegations were not vague. She didn't speak in metaphors. She identified her father as abusive. She spoke about manipulation, intimidation, and psychological harm. And once again, the same name surfaced. Michael Braxton. The man the public barely knows. The man who never appears on the show. The man who isn't interviewed. The man whose absence has always been explained away, but never explained. That absence began to feel intentional. Because if Ashley's claims are false, where's the defense? If Tamar's claims are exaggerated, where is the transparency? If nothing happened, why does silence remain the dominant response? These questions don't accuse. They demand accountability. And they become heavier when placed next to Tamar's past disclosures. Tamar said she was abused for 10 years. She said it happened in her household. She said it involved more than one person. She never publicly named them, but the proximity has always been there. Ashley's father, Tamar's brother, the shared household, the shared culture of silence. Lakeisha Kesha never claimed certainty. What she did was connects that the family itself seemed desperate not to acknowledge. She asked the question viewers were afraid to ask out loud. If it wasn't Michael, then who was it? Because someone was. And when abuse is disclosed, but no one is named, and the family responds with deflection instead of investigation, the silence becomes complicit. That's what made Ashley's voice so disruptive. She didn't just tell her own story. She validated Tamar's pain without even trying. Suddenly, Tamar didn't sound isolated. She sounded echoed. And that terrified people. Because it challenged the long-standing narrative that Tamar was simply emotional, dramatic, or unstable. It reframed her as something else entirely. A survivor. One who may have been dismissed for decades because her truth was inconvenient. Ashley's statements also revealed something else, something quieter, but just as damaging. She said she felt abandoned by the family. Not protected. Not embraced. Not defended. Abandoned. She said the family made her feel like what happened to her was somehow her fault. That she was the problem for speaking. That the damage she endured became secondary to the damage her words might cause the family's image. That detail matters. Because Tamar said something eerily similar. She said when she revealed her trauma, it didn't bring her closer to her family. It pushed her further away. And that is the cruelest part of generational trauma. The victim becomes the disruption. Ashley didn't grow up watching her aunts on television the way fans did. She grew up watching silence win. Watching discomfort get buried. Watching accountability never arrive. And when she finally decided to speak, she didn't do it to attack the family. She did it because she could no longer carry it alone. That is why Tamar and Ashley's bond makes sense. Not publicly, not performatively, but emotionally. Survivors recognize survivors. They recognize the language of minimization, the language of disbelief, the language of that's just your truth. When Ashley spoke, Tamar didn't distance herself. She listened. And in families like this, listening is revolutionary. Because the Braxton family has always been loud, on screen, in interviews, in confessionals. But when it comes to this subject, the volume drops to a whisper. No investigations announced. No family meetings addressed publicly. No statements acknowledging Ashley's pain. Just silence. And silence is not neutral. Silence protects someone. The question is, who? The family that chose image over healing. At some point, every powerful family faces the same crossroads. Truth or control. Healing or image. For the Braxtons, that crossroads arrived quietly. But once it did, there was no turning back. Because when Tamar Braxton spoke her truth publicly, the family did not rally around her in the way many expected. They did not close ranks to investigate. They did not publicly affirm her claims. Instead, they did something far more damaging. They qualified her pain. They wrapped disbelief in polite language. They dressed doubt in respectability. They turned trauma into a matter of perspective. She spoke her truth. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the truth. That sentence became a fracture line. On the surface, it sounded fair, reasonable, even compassionate. But for anyone who understands trauma, and especially for survivors watching, it rang hollow. Because when abuse is disclosed, neutrality is not neutral. Saying, "That's her truth," doesn't suspend judgment. It redirects it. It places the burden of proof back on the victim. And suddenly, Tamar wasn't just a survivor. She was a narrator whose credibility was up for debate. The sisters insisted they were being misunderstood. They said they never denied Tamar's experience. They said they respected her right to speak. They said they simply couldn't confirm what they didn't witness. But here's the problem with that stance. Abuse rarely happens in front of witnesses. And families that wait for proof often wait forever. Instead of asking what happened, the conversation shifted to how it was told. Was the show staged? Were reactions reenacted? Was Tamar being fair to the family? Was the network responsible? The focus drifted from harm to optics, from healing to damage control. The sisters emphasized that they never made the 911 call public. They stressed that they didn't leak the audio. They distanced themselves from the boyfriend. They pushed accountability outward, toward the network, toward outsiders, toward circumstance. But Tamar wasn't talking about logistics. She was talking about betrayal. She felt that her family, intentionally or not, benefited from her breakdown. That her lowest moment became a storyline. That her trauma became episodic content. That her silence was finally profitable. And when Tamar said she felt exploited, the sisters responded by saying they only discussed how they felt. That distinction mattered to them. But to Tamar, it sounded like erasure. Because when a survivor says, "I was hurt," and the response is, "But let us tell you how that hurt us," the pain doesn't get shared, it gets redirected. The conversation stopped being about Tamar's suffering and became about the family's discomfort. And that is where image quietly overtook healing. The Braxton brand is built on resilience, on togetherness, on survival through chaos. A public acknowledgement of internal abuse, especially involving a male family member who has never been scrutinized, threatens that narrative. It doesn't just damage reputations. It destabilizes the story they've been selling for decades. So instead of confronting the allegations head-on, the family defaulted to something safer. Distance. Tamar unfollowed her sisters. She unfollowed her mother. To the public, it looked like drama. To those who understand trauma, it looked like self-preservation. The sisters downplayed it. They said Tamar had done this before. They said social media doesn't define real relationships. They joked. They brushed it off. But timing matters. This wasn't random. This wasn't petty. This happened after Tamar told the world she had been abused and felt disbelieved. When someone withdraws after being invalidated, it's not manipulation. It's survival. The sisters also insisted that Tamar still speaks to them privately. That unfollowing doesn't mean estrangement. That the bond remains. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You can talk to someone and still not feel safe with them. And safety, not love, is what survivors need most. Meanwhile, Ashley Braxton remained largely unsupported by the family at large. No public statements acknowledging her pain. No visible efforts to protect her.
No televissträckning.
Just silence. And silence again did its work. It protected the structure. It preserved the image. It avoided the risk. But it also sent a message to Tamar, to Ashley, and to anyone watching, that the family would rather manage perception than confront possibility. That accountability was optional. That belief was conditional. That truth was negotiable. And this is where the story stops being about individuals and starts being about systems. Because families, especially famous ones, often operate like institutions. They prioritize continuity. They minimize disruption. They absorb damage quietly and move on. But trauma doesn't move on. It waits. It resurfaces. And sometimes it shows up in the next generation. Ashley's voice didn't just reopen Tamar's wounds. It exposed a cycle. One where silence is enforced. One where credibility is questioned. One where speaking costs more than staying quiet. And at this point, the question was no longer whether Tamar and Ashley were telling the truth. The real question became this. Why was the family so unwilling to ask? The question in '01 can escape. Every story reaches a moment where silence stops working. For the Braxton family, that moment did not arrive with a headline. It didn't come with a lawsuit or a press conference. It arrived quietly, through patterns that refused to disappear, through voices that echoed each other across generations, and through a question no amount of fame could drown out. Who does silence protect? Because by the time Tamar Braxton told the world she had been abused as a child, the silence had already done its damage. And by the time Ashley Braxton shared her own experience inside the same bloodline, the silence no longer looked accidental. It looked preserved. Tamar never asked the public to pick sides. She didn't name names. She didn't turn her pain into a spectacle. What she asked for explicitly and implicitly was belief. Not sympathy. Not ratings. Belief. And what she received instead was caution. Her sisters said they respected her truth. They said they supported her healing. They said they loved her. But love without validation feels hollow to someone who has already survived violation. When Tamar said she felt exploited by television, her sisters said they were only sharing their perspective. When she said her pain became a storyline, they said it was unavoidable. When she said she felt betrayed, they said it was unfair to blame them. No one said, "We believe you." And that absence speaks louder than any denial. Ashley's voice changed the stakes. Because Ashley didn't grow up in the spotlight. She didn't benefit from brand protection or media training. Her statements weren't polished. They were raw, hesitant, and deeply personal. She spoke about control, about intimidation, about being told not to speak. And suddenly, Tamar's experience no longer stood alone. It was mirrored. 2 women, 2 generations, 1 family culture that responded to disclosure with distance. At that point, the story stopped being about individual credibility and started being about systemic avoidance. Because when one person speaks, families can dismiss. When 2 people speak, families deflect. But when patterns emerge, silence becomes a strategy. No one publicly asked Michael Braxton to respond. No investigation was announced. No family reckoning occurred on screen or off. Instead, the narrative shifted to optics. Was the family being attacked? Those questions protected the structure, but not the people inside it. And here is the truth no one wants to confront. Families don't need proof to show care. They need courage. Courage to say, "We hear you." Courage to say, "We may not understand, but we take this seriously." Courage to say, "If harm happened, we will confront it, no matter who it implicates." That courage never arrived. Instead, Tamar stepped back. She unfollowed. She withdrew. She protected herself. And Ashley was left to stand alone. That doesn't mean the family is guilty of the acts alleged. But it does mean they chose image management over open accountability. And that choice has consequences. Because silence teaches future generations what to expect. It teaches victims that speaking costs too much. It teaches abusers that consequences are unlikely. It teaches families that unity matters more than truth. But trauma does not stay contained. It leaks. It resurfaces. It finds new voices. And that is why this story refuses to die. Not because people love drama, but because unresolved harm has gravity. It pulls attention back to itself until it is acknowledged. The final question isn't whether Tamar's truth matches someone else's version of events. The final question is simpler and heavier. Why is it so hard to say, "We believe you enough to investigate"? Why is belief treated as a threat instead of a starting point? And why does protecting the family name seem to matter more than protecting the family members who say they were hurt? Until those questions are answered, the silence will keep speaking. And it will keep asking the same thing over and over until someone finally listens. This story is not about tearing down a family. It's about what happens when families refuse to look inward. Because healing doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with willingness. And the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of truth.